for coming. This is Veterans Day weekend. When Lisa and I first started to talk about doing this talk and selected a topic, then we thought Coast Guard, military, Veterans Day worked out well. So we chose this date because it's Veterans Day and to kind of celebrate some of that Coast Guard and veteran history. And I'll discuss as we go through here the tie. And some people aren't familiar with the Coast Guard. I think that if the best guy sitting here. Let's see. Which is the best way of progressing it. Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's these right here.
All right, good. Not here. Okay. Yeah. I think most people, when they think of the Coast Guard, think of search and rescue. Helicopter. We have actually the oldest Coast Guard air station is here on Cape Cod. Didn't start here on Cape Cod, started up in Gloucester as the oldest, but it was moved to Salem and eventually down here about 50 years ago. But so helicopters and small boats going out and doing rescues. And that's an important part of it, but it's clearly not the major part of the Coast Guard missions. We do many, many other things that people have little idea ever existed even. International Ice Patrol. I'll go through some of that in a second, but I'm going to try to hit some of the history, but let me start out by defining the Coast Guard a little bit. We're under the Department of Homeland Security. We had been in the Department of Transportation, and before that, in the Department of Treasury, and then during a time of war, we're under the Department of Defense. So I'd say we're the Department of Homeland Treasury offering transportation security when we're not defending the country. That's the easiest way to say it. So I think I can leave it at that. Any questions? We can. I'm being a little facetious. The Coast Guard is one of the six now arms of armed forces. This is armed military. There are six now that Air Force has. I mean, the Space Command has been added, or Space Force has been added. It's certainly not the largest, but we're no longer the smallest. The Space Force is the smallest. That's the good news. But put it in perspective, the Army is about 10 times larger than the Air Force. So the Air Force, 10 times larger than the Coast Guard. The Army is approaching 500,000 regular, and ours is closer to a little less than 50,000 people. So it's small. We're about the eighth the size of the Air Force and the Navy, and about a third to a quarter of the size of the Marine Corps. But we are about 3.5 times the size of the Space Force. I'll go with that. We're not the oldest, but other than the Air Force and the Space Force, all of those services I just mentioned had origins back in the 1700s, Revolution time, late 1700s, that time, including the Coast Guard. The significance of that is that after the Revolutionary War, the Continental Navy, the Continental Army, Marine Corps, all were dissolved. The Army reconstituted almost immediately as the new U.S. Army. So in, I think it was 1883, 84, the Continental Army was disbanded and the U.S. Army was started immediately, same people. The Navy, though, went away and they didn't come back until later in the 1800s. So as our sister organization, we like to kid them to say that we're your older sisters, because ours came in 1790 during Washington's second year of Washington's first administration. He took over in 1789, and he formed what was called the Customs Service, and the Customs Service needed some help on the sea, so they formed a Revenue Cutter Service, which is the predecessor of the Coast Guard. I'll get to that in a little bit, but just to put it in perspective, we're small. If you look at the other uniform services, we're larger, like the Public Health Service, the NOAA, what's the other one? The Merchant Marine, and so forth. Those are other uniform services. But for military, there are only 6 of us, and obviously the Space Force is very new. I don't even know everything the Space Force does. They have the GPS system. They have about 70 to 80 satellites that are flying that they operate, mostly surveillance satellites. So, I have a lot of friends that are naval officers. In fact, I'll give a lot of asides here and some little personal stories. There's a movie coming out late next week, before Thanksgiving, called Devotion. Devotion is a movie about devotion to duty. It's about Tom Hudner and Jesse Brown. And Tom won the Medal of Honor. Tom's a good friend. He's now passed away about 3 years ago. He won the Medal of Honor in Korea. the movie looks like it's going to be great. Many of these movies that based on books don't turn out to be good, but this one, the initial reviews are good. So I would recommend, I really can't recommend it because I haven't seen it either, but I knew Tom Hudner very well, who's the person this is talking about, and a great person. So not always do movies of great people turn out to be great movies, but my friends in the Navy, though, we do a lot of work with them, but the friends in the Navy typically tell me that, just kidding, said you have to be over 6 feet to be in the Coast Guard, just so when your ship goes down, you can wade ashore. And then I either throw back the issue of, we're your older sister, take care of us. But often what I go back with is this one. What is the Coast Guard? And the answer is Coast Guard is the heart and soul around which the Navy forms in time of war. I think people are surprised the extent of our national defense mission. It's one that doesn't get a lot of publicity, nor do we want a lot of publicity for it, but spend a lot of time and a lot of our resources devoted to national defense. The early part of the Coast Guard, I mentioned dates just a few minutes ago. The Coast Guard is 1790. The Navy didn't come back into existence until 1796, 97. The Constitution and Constellation were first operational commission in 1798, probably. So for that first 10 years of our existence, almost 10 years of our existence as a nation, the Coast Guard, or what was called Revenue Cutter Service at the time, were our military naval force on the water, and quite proud of that. Those are times of the Barbary pilots, the quasi-war that we had back then with France in the late 1700s. That's when it became clear that we actually did need a Navy, a standing Navy too, when it was starting to be built. Then, of course, the War of 1812 after that. So today I'm going to give you a short history and talked about being about another 35 minutes of history of the Coast Guard. That's challenging for me. I've spent a lot of my life looking at Coast Guard history, and now being at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum over in Barnstable Village, we are one of only 2 museums in the country that are telling Coast Guard history. So I'm only using a note to keep track of what I have for slides here, but there are, I should say, 3 general areas that Coast Guard missions come under. We have officially about 11 different missions. There are actually more than that, but minor missions, but they all fit under maritime safety, security, and stewardship. You can almost fit anything under there, except world hunger maybe. But those are the missions that evolve. But my reason to the talk today is going to say, how did we get here? How do we get now in 2022 to what the Coast Guard is today? And trying to keep with my notes just a little bit. I had the honor and privilege for serving in the Coast Guard for 31 years. It really was. It was challenging. It was rewarding. A lot of things good happened when we had a chance to serve in Europe, in Greenland, in the East Coast, all over the country. Didn't get into the Pacific much, but it was a rewarding career. And early on in a career in the Coast Guard, we learned that there are 3 words that doesn't need to apply much to politics today: is honor, respect, and devotion to duty are critical to our background. We grew up in that world of those 3 things being what drove us. And I mentioned just now the film by Tom Hudner, Devotion, kind of dwells on that quite a bit too. This being a veteran, being someone who was proud of what they did in the military was important to him. I'm going to give you just a very quick introduction of myself, and I have a hard time doing that. I'm a New Englander, and we don't talk about ourselves very much, and certainly in the Coast Guard we didn't talk about, but it serves as a little bit of a template for what the Coast Guard, because I had a chance to do a lot of different things, and I'm very familiar with what I did, so it's easier to talk about what I did, I suppose. But let me throw up here just a quick slide. Here you can see, starting at the upper left-hand corner, I commanded a NATO station in Italy. It was on an island. This is the island up in the left-hand corner. It's an island called Lampedusa, about 6.5 miles long and about 1.5 miles wide. On the far end, down there, you can't quite see it, far upper right-hand corner of that island picture, is the town of Lampedusa, and about 5,000 people in a fishing community. The end that I was on, there you can't see very well here, very steep cliffs were way up high. And my role with a military crew was to provide support for the 6th Fleet, which is the U.S. Navy fleet in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, mostly navigational support we're providing for them. This was close to Gaddafi in Libya. We were a short distance away. In fact, just after I left there, we had a gunboat come over and attack our end of the island. But I'm convinced that so I wasn't there at that point. I'd been gone for several months. And I'm convinced that the boat crew came over thinking it was a suicide mission, attacking a U.S. military base with a small gunboat. But frankly, as a Coast Guard base, we had maybe a couple of 45 pistols and maybe an M16 or something. We couldn't have possibly done them. We couldn't even hit them. They're so far away. But I'm sure they came in thinking it was a suicide mission. They came in, and I think it was ready, aim, fire. They missed the entire island. You can see the senseless island and the cliffs on the side. It's hard to imagine that they could miss it, but they got away and flew away. We never knew we were attacked until the next day we went down into town and they said, "How'd you guys survive last night?" I was also in the lower left corner. I was also on a medium endurance cutter. It was a 210-foot cutter. Most of the time here off New England, off Cape Cod, out in Elevator Shoals or further out. Much of the time was when we're not involved in a search and rescue case, which was not continuously, fortunately. We're involved in fishing management. This was the era back in the early 70s. We had a large commercial fishing fleet, foreign fishing fleet off Cape Cod. That changed later on, but it was Russian, Chinese, Polish, several different countries. And these were gigantic ships. They would come in factory ships. And the smaller fishing vessels were still 300 feet or more. They were just raking all our fish out. That's part of the start of our difficulty with getting the fishing grounds reestablished again and rebuilt with the stocks. Some of the stocks are just gone forever as far as that commercially viable. Halibut was one of those, is pretty much gone. So anyway, I spent a lot of time out there on that vessel off New England, spent time in Washington, D.C. in charge of what was the search and rescue policy program in Washington, D.C. later in my career. In the upper right-hand corner behind my head there is doing surveys of glaciers on the west coast of Greenland. That's particularly interesting today as we look at melting and what's happening in the Greenland ice cap. I was there over 50 years ago and looking at glaciers and measuring them. Some of these glaciers were moving at as much as 5 meters a day or even faster. That sort of glacier you think of very, very slow. These were you can measure them being. That was what we're doing, is measuring the speed of these glaciers. That was related to an organization I'll mention very briefly later on, the International Ice Patrol, which started from the time of the Titanic in 1912. Hit an iceberg, obviously, and at that point we started surveying where all the icebergs were, and we go back to the origin up in Greenland where they began. The lower right-hand corner is my jobs in what we call ops ashore, where I had stations working for me, first in Maine and then in Boston. And these were small boat stations. These were what are called ANT teams, aids to navigation teams that do lighthouse repair, do buoys repair, that sort of thing. And even some small domestic icebreakers, 140-foot icebreakers that break some of the ice, particularly up in Maine. But it was interesting. It was a lot of fun on occasion. The picture there shown here is Schooner Fest, I think, or the Windjammer Fest up in Boothbay Harbor. I believe that's, and I think that's the Angelica, is the red-sailed vessel there. So it's those high points, and there are some points that are a little comical. For example, for those that are familiar with Minot's Light, which is off Cohasset, it's a light that had rough beginning. It was first built, it fell down a storm and everyone on board was lost, but it was rebuilt as a stone structure, very secure structure now. And with lighthouses, you tend to want to have a characteristic of that lighthouse. So someone coming through the fog to shore sees a lighthouse, they can identify it immediately. I think most of you are familiar with out near Nauset, there was the Three Sisters that were there, 3 lighthouses. Then someone came in and saw 3 lighthouses lit up. They could say, well, I know where I am. I'm at Nauset. The lighthouses down in Chatham, there used to be 2 lighthouses there. Turned out finally, as technology advanced, they were able to take the light itself and change the characteristic of the light. Maybe have it flashing every 10 seconds or flashing in different signals. And when that happened, the lighthouse down in Chatham was moved up to Nauset, and the Three Sisters were actually sold off, finally brought back together recently, and they're on display up at Nauset Heights. But the Minot's Light had a unique characteristic. It was right near Boston Light. Boston Light would flash now in the last 50 years or so, every 10 seconds it would flash. So it was set up electronically to do that. So if you're coming in, which I often did back into Boston with a ship, coming through a fog, you could see the light first. If it's flashing 10, you know that was Boston Light, and if you're going in to keep to the left, for example. Minot's Light was flashing 1 and then 4, and then 3 flashes. So you can identify, you count them and say, that's minus light. Does that ring a bell with anyone about what that could mean to people, the 1, 4, 3 light? It became known as the I love you light. 1, I love you, 1, 4, 3, spelling it out. And it was a place that people would come to reaffirm their vows on shore, whether it's their 10th anniversary or maybe it's proposed, or go to the shoreline, look out at minus light, I love you light. So they come back every year. Well, one year when I had command of Group Boston, the light, we had a major storm that came through, ice storm, and it covered the light with ice. And it took out at that point, it had been automated, but it was on solar power. And it took out the solar panels, just like water was breaking over the top of the lighthouse. The lighthouse survived fine, but the light wasn't on. And it'd be surprised, maybe it wouldn't be surprised, but the number of calls we got from people, desperate people that had come back from Buffalo to reaffirm their vows and said, we come here and the light is out. Well, after we explained to them, it was risking people's life to get up there now. Another few days, we'll be able to get the ice will melt and we can climb up the ladder and get the thing fixed. But they understood, but it was sort of comical at the time. I didn't fully appreciate how many people would come back to the I love you light to find out. So interesting career, because these things would pop up, but it wasn't all, there are good days and there are, let me go back here, and there are bad days too. Bad days are typically involved with search and rescue. The idea is, or doing alien interdiction. These are people that are trying to get away from poverty, get away from, and you're stopping them and returning them to poverty and maybe persecution. Search and rescue is that way. It's a very rewarding experience to save somebody in the water, to go out and save a life, whether it's in the water or as we're doing right now, Hurricane Ian, we had all sorts of helicopters down there picking people off their mobile homes or whatever down there. That's another part of Coast Guard people don't necessarily understand, but we get involved in all that sort of stuff. And that's saving lives is obviously rewarding, but you don't save all of them. There was a vessel out of Gloucester when I was up there in 1994. It's called the Italian Gold. It's a 78-foot fishing vessel. We don't know exactly what happened to it. It was hit by a wave, and the EPIRB, that's a device that goes off automatically, went off. The EPIRB is an electronic positioning indicating radio beacon, that acronym. And when a vessel gets flooded, it will automatically go off. We got a sighting and a blip from it in our operations center in Boston. At the same time, the Canadian Coast Guard got a blip, and they had actually another vessel they were looking for. They were the closest to this Italian Gold. They flew over it. When they flew over it, they could see it had turtle, just the bottom that was going down. So we knew exactly where it was. We got out there about 10 minutes later on our helicopters, and it was gone. And every indication was it was gone, and there was no survivor. Probably hit by a rogue wave. It was a very tough storm. They went down. We searched for another 3 days. But to sit down with the families and discuss that it's time to stop searching. We know where it went down. There's no chance they survived. We do all sorts of tests about survivability in different temperature waters and that sort of thing. But these were Gloucester fishermen and Gloucester fishermen's families. They understood that. They sat down with us and they said, yes, we really appreciate you searching this time. We understand this is a dangerous occupation. My wife and I and some other Coast Guard people at the station briefed them. Finally, we had briefed them all every day. We all walked together up to the chapel in Gloucester and sat there in memorial service for him. And it was very emotional, frankly. So those are some of the bad days. They're not necessarily really bad days, but very emotional days and sad days. Let me continue on. I want to just put a little bit of a blurb here on the Coast Guard Museum. I mentioned to you earlier, this museum we just finished our season yesterday, 18th season. We've been there forever. And if you haven't been there, I think you would be surprised. A lot of interactive stuff, a lot of Coast Guard history, much of it related to Massachusetts and New England. I'll show you in a second why Massachusetts is considered the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Thus, we're here. This isn't necessarily the birthplace of this particular building built in 1856, but it is important as a customs house and a post office. And we fill the entire building plus stuff. Unfortunately, since it's a national landmark, we can't add on to it. So we're somewhat restricted in the space we have. As Lisa mentioned, we have the oldest wooden jail in the United States here. That's on the left-hand side. We have a blacksmith shop there. And we had a small theater there, although we haven't opened up the last couple of years because of COVID. It was a very small theater. We've actually done a lot of interactive stuff inside the museum. have a lot of models. This model, I'll talk about the model maker. The model maker that did this, it took him 25 years to build this model. And it's extraordinary. And we have about 130 models in the museum. I would say about 25 or 30 of them are his. He's international. I mean, he's extremely high caliber. He was a Coast Guard cook. And his uncle and father had gotten the model making. But it's extraordinary. This is one of our signature models coming in. This is of the Coast Guard cutter Campbell. Is at 200. This is about a 4.5 foot model. The cutter itself is 270 feet. Not our largest cutter, which is probably space people. We're just building some icebreakers that they're more than twice the size, 460 feet. Go back just for a second. Now that I thought about that, talking about size of the Coast Guard, the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford has a crew on board of about 4,500. That's a tenth the size of the Coast Guard with one vessel. But it's about twice the size of these new icebreakers we're building. So these new icebreakers are big. I'll show a picture in a second, I think, if we get to it. See how we're doing on 20. We have a lot of stuff for kids there, and we're getting more of it because that's a hard crowd to please. To say that the film, if some of you saw it, the film called The Finest Hours that came out about 5 years ago, talked about Bernie Weber and his rescue of the crew of the Pendleton off of Chatham in 1952. Kids can relate to that. The fact that the film they can think about the film. I'm having a little bit of a senior moment. I'll make a point there. I can't remember what it was. I'll maybe come back to the point in a second. But we have this selfie studio where people can take pictures in a selfie studio. We have bells that they can ring, that sort of thing. But it's a hard crowd to please. So we have birthday parties there and so forth. But we are going to try to get more young people in. It's a goal. Okay, here's the summary graph, and we don't need to go much further than this. I will go through this, but this is the history of the Coast Guard 101. You can see it starts down the lower left-hand corner. We consider our birthday as August 4th in 1790, when Washington signed the legislation to form the Revenue Cutter Service. And it's not our oldest part of the Coast Guard. In fact, Boston Light was built in 1716. Then became part of the Coast Guard later on. Massachusetts Humane Society became the U.S. Life Saving Service, which became Coast Guard. That began in the 1780s. And various other things that were basically 1700s. But we were under the Department of Treasury. And then when I first came into the Coast Guard, actually a year after I got into the Coast Guard, we moved on to the new Department of Transportation in 1967, and then moved into the newest Department of Homeland Security in 2003. So we've been moved around a lot. The unique issue with the Coast Guard as an armed force is it's not in the Department of Defense, except in time of war, during World War II, that take some reserve officers and auxiliary and have them run the day-to-day stuff, Coast Guard search and rescue. Rest of the service was overseas working with the Navy. If I had been deployed, which some of us were to the Middle East, for example, very likely I would have had Navy and Coast Guard crew working under me, both. It's a really transparent integration when it occurs. So we started out with revenue cutter. You can see a revenue cutter here in the center. And then life-saving service, unfortunately, a poor quality image I chose to put there. Lighthouse service, as I said, the first lighthouse was Boston Light in 1716. And then some what look to be fairly bureaucratic organizations, but are much more than that. The Bureau of Marine Inspection. So actually, initially it started out as the Bureau of Steamship Inspection, which sounds pretty, you can see a guy with a rubber stamp at a desk, but it was much, much more than that. It came out of the disasters when steamships started to become important. I'll get to that in a second, but this is a summary of what the Coast Guard is and how it evolved. It's a complex history. We are part of the Department of Defense for training. The Commandant of the Coast Guard serves on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's a woman now, it's a 4-star admiral, it's on the Joint Chiefs. She's the first woman to be on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are very much a part of that core interest. But the interesting part of this dynamic is we are not under the Department of Defense usually. That gives us certain things. Department of Defense, well, maybe some of the recent politicians understand this, can't take action against American citizens, U.S. citizens. they can't arrest them for drunken driving or can't arrest them for drunken boating, for example. We can, because we're not in the Department of Defense. So very often we will have Coast Guard crews on board the Navy vessels looking at people that are drug smugglers, they're U.S. citizens. The Navy can't necessarily do anything with them. It's not necessarily true. There are some things they can get around it, but we'll often have Coast Guard crews on board to help them out. Some of the real smart guys will say, you can't do anything against us. And the Coast Guard officer will step up behind them and say things like, well, they can't do anything, but I can. We do the same with the state. There are certain state rules that we can enforce, but we'll be with a mass environmental police, for example. They'll be on with us and someone will say, this is not your jurisdiction. And the mass environmental police officer will step forward and say, well, it's mine, so we're going to ticket you or fine you, whatever it might be. So that's a unique characteristic that we have, that one of the reasons that we haven't gone into the Department of Defense is so we have this unique role of being an armed military part of the federal government that's not in the Department of Defense and can act against. Now, this is not subversive in any way, but we can act against drunken boating, for example, or people operating. We are firefighters, policemen, and soldiers all in one. When I get into the Coast Guard, we're more firefighters, save the cat from the tree, that sort of thing, but fire. Then as we started to get into drug interdiction, a lot of other things became more of a policeman. And now we're as much a soldier or sailor in the Navy than we are, but we're still all three. Let me go on here. This is a map. This is probably TMI, too much information. It's a map in my bathroom at home that is from 1790 that shows the origins of the Coast Guard here in Massachusetts. The upper thing says the Revenue Cutter Service. The first revenue cutter was built up in Newburyport and home ported in Boston. The middle arrow there shows the location of Boston Light, which is the first lighthouse. And the lower location is the U.S. Life Saving Service. The first life saving station was in Cohasset in the early 1800s. So this is, and it just happened to be my jurisdiction when what we call AOR, area of responsibility, when I was in Boston. It went out a little bit further to the New York border, but basically this is it. I had the map. This shows that early origins I just mentioned, except in the lower left-hand corner, it's kind of blocked there. That would be the U.S. Life Saving Service, although it didn't begin that way. It began as a Massachusetts Humane Society. People think of Humane Society as cats and dogs and animals. At that time, in the 1700s, it was humane humans. They were responsible for start of Mass General Hospital, for example. All the members were either doctors or reverends, or there was one judge, and then the governor, Bowdoin at the time, was the head of the Mass Humane Society. And they're very interested in sailors, how many sailors were dying at sea, and they started to create huts on shore. So if it's out on Lovell's Island, for example, in Boston Harbor, quite a ways to get into land if you were shipwrecked. So if a ship were wrecked there, the crew could get off and get into these huts they had built and would have food and water to survive for a few days until they could be rescued. The problem was, and I digress here a little bit, the problem was that typical of what you might expect today, what would happen is the hunting fishermen would go up and take the stuff out of the huts, and the food and water and the fire stuff would be gone. The place to enough stuff to build a fire to keep warm. But anyway, it was a good idea. But that led to rescue stations that eventually led to the U.S. Life Saving Service, which eventually became part of the Coast Guard. I put this slide up. It's an image that was drawn by an officer on a revenue cutter, Dexter, which is shown in the foreground here. This is the Dexter, that black vessel in the lower left corner. The Dexter was a revenue cutter. The vessel in the center, you should see that it's in distress. It's called the City of Columbus. It was a vessel that was moving from Boston to Savannah, carrying about 130 people. 100 people died. All the women on shore, and there were a lot of, all the women and children died. Women and children on board died. Not because they didn't try to help them, the crew didn't try to help them, but they got them all out on deck. And just when they got them on deck to put them in life jacket, a big wave came through and wiped them all over. And none of them survived. So some of the crew survived. There were about 20 some odd people who survived, and some of the men survived. Just, I mean, they felt very guilty after that, but they were up trying to organize things up in the rafters and so forth, up in the yardarms. But I love this picture because, as I said before, the Coast Guard was an amalgamation of several different organizations. The Revenue Cutter Service merged with the Life Saving Service in 1915 to become the Coast Guard. The name Coast Guard was back then, although the day-to-day operations didn't change. And then the Lighthouse Service came in about 20 years later to become part of the Coast Guard also. This was 1884. This is the Revenue Cutter Service, the life-saving service. Some of these boats here are from the Mass Humane Society, the life-saving service. And then up on the hill here, behind my picture here of Osterville, there's the light at Gay Head in Aquina. So we have all three of them right there in 1884, that would become 30 years later would become the Coast Guard. So I love this picture because it shows all three together. So that's that's some of the rescue. I could spend a whole lecture just on this particular rescue. It was fascinating what happened, good and bad. Let me go through a little bit of Revenue Cutter Service first. Evolving from these different organizations, though, at the point of coming together as the Coast Guard in the early 20th century, were missions we have today, such as national defense. That was Revenue Cutter Service, I explained earlier. We're very much involved in national defense. Polar and domestic icebreaking, just involving cutters. I'll show you one very famous cutter here in a second, extremely famous, and I'll spend a few minutes on that. Migrant drug interdiction. Interdiction was part of our initial role of Revenue Cutter. The idea was to get these smugglers coming in the country and collect duties and tariffs from them. It was the only form of revenue we had. Customs working with Revenue Cutter was so successful that they completely eliminated national debt by the turn of the century, by 1900. We've gotten some debt back since then, but by 1900, we didn't have debt. It was pretty much gone. So immigration and law enforcement has been a long tradition with the Coast Guard. People think that search and rescue and then these other things are added on later. It's actually the way around. Homeland security, marine environment, maritime law enforcement, coastal security, international ice patrol, search and rescue, all missions that kind of came out in partial. Search and rescue was also the life-saving service too, but they all came in, and these larger cutters particularly all related to our early ties to the Revenue Cutter Service. The officers, the Winter Revenue Cutters, came in one day as Revenue Cutter officers. Next day, they were Coast Guard officers. It was transparent, the same uniforms and so forth. So it wasn't a radical change that way. And when I changed from the Department of Treasury to the Department of Transportation to the Homeland Security, didn't change day to day. Just had your boss way up the chain of command was different, but nothing else changed, or little else changed. This is the Massachusetts I just mentioned was the first Revenue Cutter. This shows interdiction, drug interdiction, ice breaking. I'll get back to this a little bit, but there are two types of icebreakers. Ice breaking, domestic and polar. I think they probably self-define each other, but we've been involved in domestic ice breaking forever. These are even small boats would have to break out the fishermen. They're iced in around their docks so they go out and do fishing. So we reinforced the hull some and did other things to help domestically. And these cutters down here, they're small tugs that are reinforced hull. They'll go up the Penobscot River and other places to open them up during the winter time so oil could get up for heating oil and so forth. So domestic, or go up the Hudson River. It's another place that I had some experience with. The other is polar icebreakers. The one up to the upper left-hand corner is the Wind class. We took over icebreaking from the Navy during World War II and kept it. We have all the icebreakers that the United States has, our Coast Guard ships. Never see them. I doubt that any of you have ever seen a Coast Guard icebreaker, but it's up in the polar regions most of the time. We're getting new icebreakers now frequently, which what the next slide is. I'll go back. These are polar icebreakers. This is the Star, Polar Star, and Polar Sea. They're getting quite old now. In fact, one of them is so old that it's being used as spare parts for the other one. But we're building new ones. They're coming in here. This is up in somewhere up in Baffin Bay, I think, between to the west of Greenland. Then the Bear was built in the 1870s and continued in service or in some form until the mid 20th century. It was around for 80 some odd years. It was being towed back in 1963 from Nova Scotia to Philly. Got caught in a storm, was being stowed and was lost, and they weren't able to find it until, which I'll get to in a second. But this was involved with. It started out as a sealer off the coast of Newfoundland. It was then bought by the Navy later in the 1800s to use for searching for the Greely expedition, which was an Arctic expedition, was lost in the Arctic. And then it was turned over to the Revenue Cutter Service, later become the Coast Guard, and was used in many different roles. But among those, the most important was up in Alaska. If you recall, Alaska was purchased in 1967, and they needed law enforcement in Alaska. And the Revenue Cutters would go up there and provide the judge, the jury, and the sheriff up there. It was really an old West type atmosphere up there. And the Bear was involved in it. So many things. I don't have time to discuss it. Again, that could be a lecture on itself. The Bear, It served with Byrd, and when he was exploring the Antarctic in the 1930s. It served in the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. It's been in the Arctic and Antarctic, only vessel in anywhere in the world that's had that much. Interesting thing about that, I find, it was extremely well built, but it sank being towed to Philly. It has a lot of namesakes over the years. This was the Bear, there have been Bears. The Coast Guard, the modern Coast Guard cutter Bear was out with some research teams, and they found it. The Bear found the Bear, if you will. And about 260 miles east of Boston, some distance south of Nova Scotia, 100 miles south of Nova Scotia up there, they discovered it, they definitely confirmed this Bear. It's there. Now, they're not going to do anything to recover it. They use it as a grave site, although there was no one on board who was being towed, but just as a fitting resting place for this really historic vessel. Sorry, it doesn't come up. The image on my screen is much better than that. It's probably our most famous vessel, and I won't go into all the rest of the fame of it right now, but because I don't have time. Let me go to some other things from the Revenue Cutter Service. National defense, as I mentioned, just going into today's history is not necessarily something that had to be done 200 years ago or even 100 years ago. Last year, 2021, the Hamilton, one of our 418-foot security vessels, was over in Black Sea and Odessa training the Ukrainians, working with Bulgaria, working with Turkey, all the NATO forces there, helping train them on operations, on marine law enforcement, that sort of thing. Fortunately, we got out of there well before the war broke out. In fact, we're out of there by early summer of last year. But we were there representing the Sixth Fleet. The Sixth Fleet didn't want to go in. Obviously, the Russians were very concerned with us even being there. This is the same size as a Navy cruiser, the Coast Guard vessel, 418 feet or a destroyer. But it's not as well armed. It's good offensively, but they don't have the missile defense systems that some of the Navy vessels had. So we felt very vulnerable in there. It would have been tragic, unfortunately, not only for the Coast Guard people, but for the world if a Russian decided to attack this vessel, because the Sixth Fleet was sitting just outside in the Med. They would come and overwhelm things. And unfortunately, I think it would have led to a world war. But it was very appropriate to be in there. We're representing a Sixth Fleet. They pretty sure the Russians weren't going to attack this Coast Guard vessel. They had some other smaller vessels with it and got a lot of goodwill with the NATO nations. This again shows this another, I think it may have been a Bulgarian cruiser off to the side with our cutter in the Black Sea again. Going back another 40 years or so, or 30 years from that time to 50 years to Vietnam, we had a strong presence in Vietnam. I had a lot of classmates that came in. I went to the Coast Guard Academy. Classmates that came in thinking that they could avoid the war. Well, it turned out we had a lot of people over in Vietnam. And we're fortunate. We only lost 7 people. And that's really amazing that only 7 Coast Guard people were lost in Vietnam during the war, because we had a lot of people over there, a lot of vessels over there. But again, I put this up just, these were smaller craft. There were some, I don't know if I have this next picture. No, I don't. Another where larger cutters are providing artillery support for the troops in Vietnam. We have meaning the Coast Guard has only had one person that's won the Medal of Honor, Douglas Monroe at Guadalcanal in 1942. And I won't go through the entire story of that. He was a landing craft, but he was saving an entire Marine battalion in Guadalcanal. Among the people there was the Marine Corps' turned out to be most famous officer, Chesty Puller. He was among the people that they saved and got off. Unfortunately, in the meantime, Douglas Monroe was there with his crew, kind of blocking the shells coming in to get the Marines off, and he was killed and won a Medal of Honor for it. So we celebrate it at the museum over here and other places around the Coast Guard, but frankly, at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, just off of 95 as you go south south of Virginia, they have a major exhibit on Douglas Monroe, Coast Guard person, primarily because of his efforts to save all these Marines during World War II. Life-saving service, again, another arm that I talked about earlier. Search and rescue came from that. Marine environmental protection, port security, boating safety, use of living resources. It's hard to differentiate all our missions here in one thing because they all kind of merge together and different missions have been added since then. shipwrecks are a big reason that the Coast Guard existed in the early form, is protect people, whether it's lighthouse service or life-saving service. You look out here and say, doesn't look too bad. It's nice and calm, summertime, waves coming in, sand. You think of shipwrecks running into each other, but for those that have spent time at sea, running aground in here in sand with the big waves coming in can tear a ship apart as rapidly as hitting a grounded ledge. So it turns out that this area is notorious for shipwrecks. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Cape Cod up there, known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, of the North Atlantic. It's also the Outer Banks, consider them on Sable Island up off of Nova Scotia, then down in the Bahamas, particularly the traffic there during the 1600s and 1700s with the Spanish coming back with bullion and so forth, and a lot of accidents down there. But Graveyard Atlantic, this was at the time of our early existence as a nation, this was the interstate highway system, people moving goods back and forth. We didn't have paved highways at that point. This is the Mass Humane Society. I won't dwell on this. The guy in the center here, Joshua James, very historic, a very heroic guy, served for, I think, 65 years in doing rescues up near Point Allerton, just south of Boston. He died on duty. I'll just mention very quickly, there was a tragic case out in Monomoy, just south of Chatham, where much of the crew of the station there was lost in a rescue. And Joshua James, the guy in black in the center, was so distressed by that, he tried to get his crews out more to get trained. He didn't want them having his crew. And he was out in a fairly rugged weather training a crew. When they get back in, he stepped ashore and said, I think his last words were, "The tide is ebbing." He keeled over and died right there. It was not in the middle of a rescue, but he wanted to train his crew. But he was, I think, in his 80s at that point. Again, subject for another. This would be on its own a subject. I won't spend a lot of time. This is Sumner Increase Kimball. He was the head of the U.S. Life-Saving Service for its entire existence. By the time it came in 1871 until 1915, he's considered, this may not sound like a compliment, the most proficient and best public bureaucrat administrator that ever existed. He hired somebody named William O'Connor. It was William O'Connor, who was a journalist, and wrote things about the heroic rescues that are going on, and they became bestsellers. And it led to funding for the Revenue Cutter Service, for the life-saving service. But just his administration and changing things around, there's a lot of nepotism going on, a lot of resources that were being wasted. Great individual, local from, he actually taught in Brewster for a while, believe it or not, for a summer or two. Get rid of this thing on the side here. And I'm just about out of time, so these are just showing some of the stations and how they're built. All these stations, there are 13 of them there. 9 of them were built within the year after Sumner Kimball took over the life-saving service, all built in the 1870s. None of them exist anymore. We have life-saving stations there, but not these. Lighthouse service, pretty obvious. AIDS navigation, lighthouses, buoys, Loran, all sorts of things that came out of that today. But GPS essentially evolved from there. Although I mentioned earlier, GPS is now run by the by a Space Force, people not the Coast Guard anymore. But we now have, just looking for my number here, we now have, hold on, just give me 1 second. Now have one more page, because it's fairly impressive. Have 45,664 fixed and floating aids. These include lighthouses, buoys. This is all part of the Coast Guard mission, taking care of all these. So this lighthouse service evolved into that. Highland Light, the largest and oldest lighthouse on Cape Cod, it was actually authorized by Washington before he was president. Authorized by Washington in the about a couple of years before he became president. He was president of the Continental Convention at the time. He was built in 1797. Or at he authorized it back in the 1780s. I think I had the wrong date there. I think it was 1787 it was built. Lightships. Again, I have a whole lecture on lighthouses and lightships. Nantucket Sound was known as Lightship Alley. It had the highest concentration of lightships anywhere in the world. Lightships are nothing more than floating lighthouses. There are places that lighthouses couldn't be built because of the land and so forth. We have Nantucket Lightship, just to put in perspective, There's Nantucket Sound up above there, up in here is Nantucket Sound and Nantucket. Nantucket Lightship was way down here. It marked the southern extent of the shoals down there. So anyone coming out of Boston or Salem going down to Philly or Baltimore, New York, or even going around South America, going over to the Orient to trade over there, had to go through this area. So Lightship was down there from the early parts of the 1800s until it was finally decommissioned in 1985. But it had periods of extreme boredom and accentuated by minutes of excitement. Lightships, including Nantucket, were run over by ships, and people died. Mike Maynard is, I mentioned before that model that is in one of our models in the front of our museum was made by Mike. Took him 25 years. Outstanding model maker. He was this is a picture I took of him the day before yesterday. So he's aging some, but he was a cook on the Cutter Campbell, and he is still producing models for us. Some of them are really spectacular. But he was on a lightship. He was on the Nantucket Lightship back in the 80s, and his chief bosun mate on board was deathly afraid of birds. Deathly is probably an overstatement. Extremely afraid of birds. But the migrating birds coming down from the maritime provinces this time of year would fly across the Gulf of Maine and would get down to Nantucket, the vicinity, Nantucket Lightship, and they'd be pretty exhausted. Not that they couldn't continue on, but they would land on Nantucket Lightship and just kind of collapse for a while. Still very much alive, but you can easily go over and pick them up. They were yellow. Mike said they were yellow birds, whether they're yellow finch or some sort of canary. I don't know what they were, but they're fairly small. Well, he knew, again, periods of extended boredom on board. He knew that his bosun mate chief was afraid of any type of bird, but the chief had left his porthole open. So all the guys went around and collected the birds, and the chief was asleep in there, put about a dozen birds inside, and then all of a sudden you hear this god-awful screech, and the captain of the lightship came down and said, "Gee, go help chief. He's obviously in distress." So they said, "Okay, we're going to help him collect the birds," but they were the extent of it. Now, again, it just accentuates, not that it's a fantastic story, but it shows you how bored they would get. Anything. That was one of the excitements of probably their whole cruise, is scaring their chief to death. Mike's an interesting character. He lives up in Providence, north of Providence now. I put this up here briefly because this is the Olympic, a sister ship of the Titanic, that ran into the Nantucket Lightship and ran it over. This was taken by a crew member on the lightship. I'm not sure if it's a crew member who died or not, about 2 months before the ship came through on another time and ran it over. This was it wasn't this particular transit. It was a layer transit a few months later that ran over the top of it. I really find that amazing that picture was taken. I talked a little bit about the steamship inspection. It led to all sorts of things, including licensing of captains, for example, and vessel inspections. Life jackets against a Coast Guard approved came out of all of that. ANVR, International Ice Patrol. ANVR is tracking vessels all over the world to be responsive to emergencies. These are some of the things that led to all these changes. This was the Austria in the North Atlantic in 1858 that caught fire and burned, and it often takes a disaster such as this or Titanic to have change. All these others, Andrea Doria, Argo Merchant, several here. Sometimes we're overwhelmed. That's a Coast Guard cutter in the middle, and a fairly large, this is an LNG tanker coming out of Boston. But still have law enforcement authority. I'll end up with just one last thing, and I'll have to skip through this fairly fast. There are a lot of notables on Cape Cod that have made significant contributions to the Coast Guard. I'll add a few. This is Archie Stone. He was the pilot of the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. He was a Coast Guard pilot. He was Coast Guard pilot #1. Not necessarily the GOAT, although he's very good, but he was the one at first. He flew across the Atlantic with a Navy crew on board, the aircraft called the NC-4. There's a picture of it. With it wasn't solo, and it wasn't nonstop. Lindbergh, 8 years later, was that way, but this was a pretty good size aircraft. Just to give you some idea of the size, the distance between the wings in this biplane is about 12 feet. This is a big aircraft. And it flew from Chatham, there was a naval air station out there at the time, to across. This just shows where it went to Nova Scotia, to Newfoundland, Azores, and Portugal. but it was the first. This is these are some of our pristine or premier cutters, our flagship cutters. There are 8 of them, national security cutters. The one you just saw in the Black Sea here is one of them. This was the most recent one, named after Archie Stone. This is Iceberg Smith. Dr. Smith, he made admiral. He was the director of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute for a while. Extremely interesting individual. I don't have time to talk about him. Like Titanic sinking helped me do that. I'll just note, he was the first person in the world to get a doctorate in physical oceanography. Because it was a fairly new science, but still an extraordinary individual. Bernie Weber, if you saw the film, The Finest Hours, he was the coxswain of that rescue off of Chatham in 1952. Again, a heroic rescue. Heroism I define as someone who goes out not expecting to get back or to be badly injured. And he didn't think he was going to get back. We went out and rescued 32 people. When we just got 2 new kittens at home last year, someone suggested we name him after a Coast Guard hero. So we named the new cat Bernie Weber Webb. Bernie Weber was a Coast Guard hero. Webb the cat, not so much a hero. Just didn't, not the heroism, doesn't have the heroism gene in it. But Dan Burbank over in Yarmouthport. Dan was a Coast Guard pilot, still is. I mean, he's around, the Coast Guard pilot, retired now. Helicopter pilot, was assigned by the Coast Guard to NASA. He spent nearly a year in space, quite a bit, many months in space as a NASA astronaut. We've had 2 Coast Guards that have been assigned to NASA. Another function you don't think of Coast Guard. We've had Coast Guard people. Dan spent a lot of time in space. In fact, this is more familiar picture you might think of him. He was still a Coast Guard officer here, but he was a NASA astronaut also. And finally, Sandy Stows. Sandy is was the highest ranking woman in the Coast Guard when she retired a couple years ago. She was the first superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy, female superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy, first female superintendent of any service academy. We now have the first woman 4-star admiral, I think I mentioned earlier, that's on head of the Coast Guard, that's a Joint Chief of Staff. But Sandy now is living here in the Cape in Falmouth, and she's doing some things working with us, but an extraordinary individual. She just wrote a fantastic new book about, I'm going to mess up the title of it. It's like Breaking Ice and Breaking Glass. It's to do with the fact that she was an icebreaker several times as an officer, but then breaking the glass ceiling to reach the rank she did. She was a vice admiral, 3-star admiral when she retired. Great person. I've got to know her fairly well over the last year. I'm through. If you have any questions, I'm going to just show a couple things here. I'll leave these up here as I show you what I have. Any questions before, please, any questions came in at all? Assume she didn't have any questions. I've got I want to bring over some artifacts or a few artifacts. Maybe I can keep this up and show these. This is one that's interesting. Once they set out their, this is called breeches buoy from shore, that set out this apparatus that would go out to an offshore ship and they'd be able to pull people ashore in this breeches buoy operation. And they'd bring the cart down. They have a Lyle gun, a gun that would fire a projectile out to it, and then they'd have line that feed out to it. So there's a lot of these stations weren't well funded. So after they got all the gear, after they rescued everyone, they wanted to get their gear back, but there's no one left on the vessel. Hard time convincing someone to stay out there, the suicide mission, to cut the line so they can pull everything back. So this is a classic case of necessity is the motherhood of invention. This is not one of our more precious artifacts necessarily, but this is a hawser cutter. And you can see the guys at the station sitting around over a cup of coffee on the mess deck saying, we need something, some way of being able to cut that line way out in the ship, so then it will release everything, we can pull everything back ashore and get our line back, use it for other rescues. So the carpenter's mate and some other people would get together, and he says, well, I've got some hinges here from, I'll see if I can put this in, I can't really show it too well here. I've got some hinges I can put here, we can hollow it out in the center and put the line inside, and then I can forge these little knives inside. So you would, I'm sorry, the people watching this online can't see this, but there would be a pin that went in to hold this together once they put the line through, and then these fairly sharp knives would be able to work from shore because they'd have a line go all the way back from shore, pull it a few times, it would cut through a line and recover everything back again. This is not a tool you can buy at Lowe's and Home Depot today. It was used on many of the rescue stations because once it was invented by these people, it became a standard. But it's that sort of stuff that's really, that's true of many my experience in the Coast Guard, many top operations, whether it's helicopter operations that would invent things to solve a problem they had. I'll do one other example. Helicopters, when we're responding to the helicopter operation in Houston, or the hurricane operation in Houston, 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember which hurricane that was, the name of it was, but we had all sorts of crews down there, but they're picking people off of roofs, but they didn't have, they'd have GPS that no latitude and longitude, but someone would call in and say, I'm at 23 Elm Street. Doesn't help me at all. So they would haul out their iPad that happened to have on board, and they'd punch in, and it just by GPS, and like you do with a car, they would follow in and maybe they'll pick people off the off that. So they developed a more elaborate, still iPad connections that would respond to those sort of missions. So when we just experienced that down in Southwest Florida with Ian, same thing. They had the same operation, but now they're a little better prepared. So it's just, again, a necessity and invention. So that's one. The last one I'll show you here is Lenny Desario was on a landing craft during World War II, built up in Pittsburgh. It came down, went into the Pacific, stopped in Hawaii, ended up in Okinawa, Iwo Jima. When he was in Iwo Jima, he landed on shore there. A couple of his men were fellow shipmates were killed on the shore. They got ashore. The Marines had been on there for a day or so ahead of them. They came in this large landing craft and were offloading stuff. So the Marines would come on board in the evening, particularly the first evening. They come on board because they probably hadn't slept in a day or so. They had a nice dry deck to sleep on. He had a nice hot meal. But one of the Marines came over to Leno and said, "Hey, you're a carpenter's mate. Can you make us a flagpole?" And he said, "Well, yeah, except the Army Air Corps, the predecessor to the Air Force, and the Navy have been bombing. There are no trees left. They can't make something out of wood." But I did see, when I was ashore today, I saw some Japanese water pipe that had been unearthed by all the bombing, and it seemed to be fairly straight. I can probably make a flagpole out of that, which he did. And he gave it to the Marines in the morning. It was the flagpole. No one knew this. That was used on Mount Suribachi to raise the flag with the 5 Marines up there. In fact, I brought gloves just to show that, but this is the diary. Yeah, I can. That's all right now. This is the diary he gave to us. I can show it here. But inside there's the logo, if I can find, or the passage. It says, if I can read it, it's worth listening to. We lost our first lieutenant hit by a gunshot, a sniper. 3 boats. Made a 32-foot flagpole, which turned out to be too big. It was screwed together. So when the one that was on Mount Suribachi was 16 feet, they just unscrewed it, made it into a 16-foot flagpole. The winds were too high on the top there. Then it goes on about they raised the flag on the top of Mount Suribachi the other day. Without my glass, I can't read the exact, but this is something that we have over there. So as I said, this is, come to the museum, these are just things I could easily carry. These are things, artifacts that are not just someone's man cave with some patches and a uniform. They turn into a museum. It's much more than that. It's we have a few patches and we have more uniforms we could even get hold of. Most of them are down in our archive, but I think you'll be surprised, and particularly surprised about Coast Guard history on Cape Cod. We were there at the start of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, for example. The oceanographic unit was there at the start, and many, many other things. My graduate work was in oceanography, so I have a particular interest in that. We have a new exhibit on oceanography. I say visit. Yesterday was our last day. We don't open again until the 2nd of May, so I'm sorry for that. So remember next year. That's it. Thank you.